Coming up on Network Africa. We await results from Saturday's election in Sierra Leone, even as both sides claim victory. Over 10,000 people register as refugees in South Sudan after fleeing the conflict in Sudan. Plus 4 people injured after building collapses in Egypt's Alexandria city. Hello and welcome to Network Africa on Channels Television. Thank you for joining us. I'm Anne Mwawadu. Let's begin with the Wagner Group's operations. It will continue in Mali and the Central African Republic amid uncertainty about the future of the mercenary group. And that's according to the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who says Wagner means are working, there are instructors, and the work will continue. Mr. Lavrov adds that this weekend's Wagner revolt will not affect Moscow's ties with partners and with friends. His comments add to the lack of clarity about the group's future, especially after earlier this month when Russia announced that volunteer formations will be asked to sign contracts to integrate them with the Ministry of Defense, something the Wagner leader already rallied against. The bill gave volunteer formations until the 1st of July to comply and then sign the contracts. Although the announcement did not mention Wagner directly, it was widely regarded as being part of efforts to reduce the groups and particularly the influence there. And let's continue with stories there and happenings that made headlines over the weekend.
On Saturday, Sierra Leone voted in a national election which the main opposition party hopes will see public frustration with deep economic hardship for President Julius Maada Bio's re-election bid. About 3.4 million people were registered to vote in the presidential and legislative ballot after a campaign marred by tensions that led to the cancellation of rallies in the final stages and clashes at an opposition gathering on Wednesday. The Electoral Commission said that some polling stations had also been attacked as workers tried to move voting materials. By the end of the day, there were reports that some polling stations had opened late or run out of ballot papers. 59-year-old Bio is running for a second term against 12 opponents. The race is expected to be close between the incumbent and the All People's Congress, Samura Kamara, who narrowly lost to Bio in the last election in 2018. On Sunday, renewed clashes, artillery fire and airstrikes surged once again in Sudan as the war between rival military factions entered its 11th week. The fighting between the army and paramilitary rapid support forces in Sudan has also killed at least 1,000, an underestimate according to medics. This video shows Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces saying it had seized the main base of a heavily armed police unit in the capital Khartoum. The RSF in a statement said it had taken full control of the large base belonging to the Central Reserve Police Southern Khartoum and posted footage of its fighters celebrating inside the facility, some removing boxes of ammunition from a warehouse. The conflict has displaced 2.5 million people, causing a massive humanitarian crisis. Francis Sebastian Ogier won Kenya's Safari Rally on Sunday as his Toyota team swept the top 4 places for the second year in a row. The 8-time world champion, now racing part-time, beat championship leader Kalle Rovanperä of Finland by 6.7 seconds, with Welshman Elfyn Evans a distant third and Japan's Takamoto Katsuta fourth.
5 left, don't stand.
The win was Ogier's third from 5 starts so far this season.
The tallying of results is continuing in Sierra Leone. That's after 2 days of general elections. It's still not clear who is leading in the presidential race between President Julius Maada Bio and his main contender, Samura Kamara. And both sides are now claiming they won the poll. Election observers have asked them to remain calm and wait for the official results, but there are still worries that no results have been announced. The European Union mission has asked the Electoral Commission to provide full transparency during the tabulation of results, just to ease tension. The center, Carter Center, also said it is concerned about reports indicating a lack of transparency during parts of the tabulation process. The winner of the election must secure 55% of valid votes cast. Otherwise, there will be a runoff between 2 of the candidates 2 weeks after the announcement of the results. In the meantime, soldiers have surrounded the headquarters of the main opposition party as votes are counted in the country's presidential election. The leader of the All People's Congress, Samura Kamara, says that live ammunition was fired into the building as he held a news conference. Mr. Kamara says it amounts to an assassination attempt as clouds of tear gas shrouded the building. The opposition is now hoping to unseat President Julius Maada Bio, who's standing for a second term in office. There was sporadic violence against election officials during the vote on Saturday after a tense campaign.
There was a scuffle in front of the APC party headquarters during that.
And now joining us now is Samson Itodo of Yaga Africa, who's been monitoring elections in the West African nation. Thank you very much, Samson, for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we understand that tallying of votes is on right now, but how would you assess Saturday's election?
Well, Saturday's election was peaceful, and Sierra Leoneans showed up in their numbers to cast their vote for a candidate of their choice. The election was organized within a context of deep polarization and mistrust for the Electoral Commission, as well as the security agencies upholding the principles of non-partisanship and professionalism in the management of election security operations. But to a large extent, the election was peaceful, but with some challenges. There were logistical issues that we observed related to voter identification, because there are some people who showed up to vote, but they were unable to vote. There were also logistical issues, the late delivery of materials that led to late commencement of elections in some regions. But on the whole, we'll say it's been a peaceful election. Just a few minutes ago, the first set of results have been announced, by the chair of the Electoral Commission in a nationwide press conference just about 15 to 20 minutes ago, where about 60% of provisional results, have been announced, and the tallying process is on. Well, in the build-up to the election, the chair of the commission did set 72 hours as a time for declaring the final results, even though the legal framework for the elections that governs elections in Sierra Leone requires that the Electoral Commission should declare a winner within 10 days after the date of the polls. But we have seen an announcement of provisional results, and so far, the entire country is peaceful. But in your preliminary remark, you referenced an incident that happened yesterday about the attack on the opposition party's office, quite unwarranted. And we hope that they will continue to maintain the peace, and state forces, will uphold the peace and not use the apparatus of power to intimidate opposition parties and candidates. But on the whole, the entire country, I would say, is relatively peaceful, and the people of Sierra Leone are waiting on the Electoral Commission to conclude the tallying process, which to a large extent has elicited concerns, from election observers, both domestic and international, because to a large extent there are questions as to the transparency of the process from the district to the regional as well as the national level.
But we're hearing of an attack on the opposition headquarters. Can you confirm this, and how tense is the atmosphere now? I mean, because election is already taking place. However, with this wait and all of that, the wait is another key process that determines transparency or accountability of the ballots.
Well, it does raise concerns. And as I mentioned earlier, that in the build-up to this election, there were controversies, there were intrigues, and there were a lot of debates as to whether the election should hold at the time. There were several issues that the opposition party raised in relation to the conduct of the Electoral Commission. In fact, the opposition party had called for the resignation of the chair of the Electoral Commission as well as the national commissioners. There were several mediating efforts, to address some of the concerns that they have about the voters register, about the procedure, for the tallying of the results. One of such issues that they raised was that this is the first time that in an election, in the tallying centers, there are no projectors to project the results as they are being entered into the Electoral Commission's results management database. And this has further deepened, the suspicion that stakeholders have. And the Electoral Commission should have, ensured that there's some high level of transparency, because the antidote, to mistrust, the antidote to suspicion is transparency, greater transparency, and more transparency. But if you look at the benchmarks for measuring whether a results management process, it's transparent, I would say, based on our observation, the Electoral Commission should have done more to inspire confidence on the part of the stakeholders on the results management process. But currently, it's very closed and people are just waiting. Like I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, the chair of the commission has declared provisional results. And he has said that the final results will be announced within 48 hours. And so far, so good. The whole country is peaceful. We pray it remains peaceful. But we should also, call on the state actors to refrain from engaging in provocative actions that would lead or provoke any form of street action from the opposition parties or from political stakeholders. Another troubling trend is that both political parties, right from yesterday or Saturday afternoon, have been claiming victory. And some claim landslide victory, issuing statements and declaring themselves winner in total violation of the legal framework for the elections. And as observers, we've called on the stakeholders, to refrain from doing that. It's only the Electoral Commission that is in a position to declare or announce a winner. Whether there will be a runoff or the ballot will be concluded on first ballot, because the Constitution requires that a candidate must secure 55% of the vote. If none of the candidates meet that threshold, then we will head to a runoff, just like it was done in the previous election.
All right, now how would you compare the landscape in this election in Sierra Leone and that of Nigeria's general election in February and March this year?
Well, to a large extent, if you remove just the names of the country and substitute it with Nigeria, we share a lot of commonalities in this entire process. The level of polarization was same for Nigeria, where issues around ethnicity did shape, how the entire elections went. I would say when it comes to religion, it's not playing a critical role for this particular election. The second commonality is the context for the election, the socioeconomic context. Sierra Leone is grappling, a lot of economic challenges ranging from increased debts, a very weak economy that saw citizens move to the streets to protest, the cost of living, access to basic and social amenities. This was also Nigeria in the build-up to the elections. A weak economy, there were job losses, our debt rate was on a high increase, inflation was also very, very high. And so the contexts are quite similar. If you look at election management, it's also the same thing. There were logistical challenges, there were issues relating to who gets to vote. So it's very similar to the Nigerian context. But there are lessons.
I guess we'll have to end it there because of time, but thank you very much for your time. Samson Etodo of Yaga Africa has been monitoring elections in the West African nation. Thank you, and we'll definitely be getting more details from you later.
Thank you.
Let's head to Mali now, where Malians are overwhelming approved changes to the nation's constitution in the June 18 referendum with 97% of the vote. And that's according to Mali's Electoral Commission. Mustafa Cissé, the head of the Electoral Commission, announced that the turnout among 8.4 million registered voters was just under 40%. The country's military rulers and regional powers said the vote will lead to elections in February next year and then the return to civilian rule. Since August 2020, Mali has seen 2 military coups when President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta was overthrown. Junta leader and interim president Assimi Goïta said in an address that he was convinced that this referendum paves way for a new, strong, efficient and emerging Mali, but above all, a Mali at the service of the well-being of the people. Ahead of the referendum, where there are concerns that the new constitution will give sweeping powers to the president, who will now have the right to hire and fire the prime minister and the cabinet members. Under the changes, the second parliamentary chamber is set to be created to enhance wider political representation, and the constitutional changes also designate Mali as a secular state, a move opposed by some Islamic clerics. Welcome back. More than 10,000 people have registered as refugees in South Sudan, and that's after fleeing the conflict in the region. The UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs made this known, adding that the latest influx continues to impound a dire situation as the arrival numbers are now projected to continue to increase even as fighting continues. But overall, 130,000 people have fled into South Sudan since the fighting began in April. Most of them are South Sudanese returning home. OCHA also adds that among those arriving are unaccompanied or separated children, the elderly, persons with disabilities, those with urgent medical needs, single or female-headed households, and pregnant women. Members of the United Nations Security Council are calling for the fighting in Sudan to stop and civilians protected. The permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates and current president of the council, Lana Zaki Nusseibeh, briefed journalists in New York after the council met and received a briefing in close consultations from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. According to him, the UNSC also called for the respect of international humanitarian law and the scaling up of humanitarian assistance to Sudan and to neighboring states.
Members of the Security Council met this afternoon and received a briefing in closed consultations from OCHA. Council members expressed concern regarding the ongoing fighting and underlined their support for the work of UN humanitarian agencies, UN implementing partners, and the ICRC. They called for the respect for international humanitarian law and scaling up humanitarian assistance to Sudan and neighboring states. The fighting has to stop, and civilians must be protected.
Kenya's President William Ruto has signed into law his government's first finance bill, which seeks to boost revenue through raising taxes on a number of items. One of the most controversial changes approved by Parliament last week was a doubling of value-added tax to be charged on fuel, and it's rising from 8% to 16%. Employees will also hand over 1.5% of their gross pay for the housing levy that will go into a fund that will then pay to build homes for low-income earners. President Ruto, who was elected last year, has said the government needs more money in order to be able to pay off the debts racked up under the presidency of his predecessor, Uhuru Kenyatta. However, the opposition says that they will call for protest if the tax rises came into effect. Spokesperson for opposition leader Raila Odinga calls the bill a mistake and an experiment Kenyans cannot afford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a great honor and privilege for me.
Well, let's get more on this. Joining us now is Cyrus Ombati, who's a Kenyan journalist in Nairobi. Thank you very much, Cyrus, for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you so much for having me on this channel today.
Help us understand the impact of this new law on the average Kenyan.
Actually, the new law is going to make life more difficult. More difficult than what it is now, because it's going to increase the cost of living in general, and starting with fuel, which is going to increase by almost 12 shillings Kenyan shillings. It will now cross a $2 mark per liter. So that means that life is going to be difficult more. Then there will be no more increase in terms of levies leveled on Kenyans in terms of taxes. Because people like musicians or artists who make money through maybe digital platforms, they are going to be taxed almost 5% of their total earnings. So in general, things are going to be difficult. You can't expect things to be easier.
The opposition has called it a mistake. It has even threatened further protests. What more can you tell us from reactions coming out of this new law?
It's true. There's a planned protest tomorrow. That's in Nairobi. Opposition leader Raila Odinga and his team are planning to hold a major protest meeting in Nairobi, where they'll be denouncing the whole kind of issue which was signed today by Mr. Ruto. We don't know what may happen, but because the mojo which was there is going out to be a more kind of charge in a way, because more Kenyans are complaining about the taxes which are leveled on them than it was before. And like today, we saw one member of parliament went to meet a group of teachers somewhere in Western Kenya, and they were chased away by those teachers. They show the kind of sentiments people have on the ground. People are really hungry of what they all do.
And how is President Ruto handling or perhaps responding to the backlash coming out of this? Because we understand that even some of his supporters are angry at this decision.
Well, to me, I see it as a political issue, because Ruto was trying to show the whole world of the country that he's in charge. He's pushing his agenda, and we understand the Britain Wood, as the IMF, the World Bank, are the ones who are pushing this bill. And they succeeded. Because remember, this thing had been there since last year when Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta was in power, but it was defeated. But now Ruto, when he came to power, he has pushed it through, and we know for real that the IMF, the World Bank are the ones behind the whole drama. Now, it's a wait and see what's happening. We know things are going to be difficult in general.
All right. Thank you very much, Cyrus Ombati, Kenyan journalist in Nairobi. Thanks a lot for your contribution on Network Africa.
Thank you so much.
And in Mozambique, the president, Felipe Nyusi, is calling for national reconciliation and the continuous efforts of advancing peace process as the country celebrates its Independence Day. Friday last week, the Mozambican government and the country's main opposition party, Renamo, held an event in Maputo to mark the end of the disarmament mobilization and the reintegration of Renamo militants. According to the president, the official end of the country's DDR process is one of the greatest achievements of the Mozambican people since the country's independence. After Mozambique became independent in 1975, Renamo also carried out anti-government armed activities for a very long time. After years of negotiation, the Mozambican government and the Renamo signed the Maputo Accord for Peace and National Reconciliation in 2019, which involved the disarmament and the demobilization of more than 5,000 Renamo militants in 16 bases in the country's central provinces and helping them reintegrate into the civil society. And that's it on Network Africa for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Mwawadu. Enjoy the rest of the week.